Hello, this is David from DN Cognitive Counseling. Tonight we are up to page 54 of the book White Fragility. Freedom from the burden of race. Because I haven't been socialized to see myself or to be seen by other whites in racial terms, I don't carry the psychic weight of race. I don't have to worry about how others feel about my race, nor do I worry about that my race will be held against me. While I may feel uneasy in an upper-class environment, I may take for granted that I belong racially in these settings. I certainly will not be the only white person there, unless the event is specifically organized by or celebrating people of color. George Zimmerman would have not stopped me as I walked through a gated suburban neighborhood. The nature of talking about George Zimmerman in relationship to the idea of the burden of race. George Zimmerman isn't white. I know that we've invented a new term called white Hispanic, but in reality, George Zimmerman is Hispanic. And the point is that he wasn't white, but called white because it fit a narrative, sort of like this entire book. George Zimmerman would have stopped anybody who he believed to be a potential threat. If he saw a white kid who he deemed to be looking in a certain manner or maybe dressed a certain way and out of place, he definitely would have done the same thing, just based upon the nature of what he was doing and why he was there. Now, do I agree with what he did? No. Do I think that he belongs being a vigilante on the streets? No. But the nature of what he did has nothing to do with him being a racist. He was a vigilante. He was outside looking for these types of things to begin with. And again, but don't let the narrative get in the way of the story so that it fits the mindset that she's trying to push. Patrick Rosell writes poignantly about the pain of being mistaken for a help at a black tie event celebrating National Book Award winners. I've witnessed assumption of servitude many times. I've checked into hotels with colleagues of color. I've made this assumption myself when I've been unable to hide my surprise that a black man is a school principal. When I ask a Latinx woman kneeling in her garden if this is her home. Now, this is racism. Again, because she grew up in an all-white area with only white people and didn't have any idea that a principal could be black, despite the fact that you have that beautiful movie Stand By Me about the true story of a principal who's black and they've been black principals around for a long time. But forgetting about that and the history of that, for her, it's not even feasible for a black man to be a principal. Wow. And she's writing this book, claiming that she's going to help people to understand about race. And the aspect of going over and asking a woman who's kneeling in the garden whether or not this is her house, that's another Karen. It's not her business if it's not her house or her property. Very few people are kneeling in other people's gardens in their other people's homes. That's not how people generally approach things. See somebody trying to wiggle somebody's door or trying to get through and you're saying, well, what's going on there? I understand that. Somebody kneeling in the garden? Not really. As I can consider career choices, I will have countless role models across the vast array of fields. When I apply for a job, virtually anyone in a position to hire me will share my race. And although I may encounter a token person of color during my hiring process, if I am not specifically applying to an organization founded by people of color, the majority of those I interact with will share my race. Again, remember, between 67 to 76% of the United States population is white. So yes, the vast majority of them are going to be white. Again, this is not anything to do with race. If I was going to be living in Japan, or if I was going to be living in India, or if I was going to be living in Saudi Arabia, and I was going for job interviews, and the majority of people that would be hiring me would be what? What a surprise. When you make up 13 and 12% and 20-something% of a population, you can't assume you're going to be the heads and the tops of everything. So this nature that she's talking about it in terms of race is a almost ridiculous argument. Once hired, I won't have to deal with my coworkers' resentments that I only got the job because I'm white. Now, this is a big issue that I've seen a lot of students, clients who have gotten something and thought, am I the beneficiary of affirmative action? And it actually breeds a sort of imposter syndrome, that I was only good enough to get this job because of affirmative action, or I was only good enough to get into this college because of affirmative action. This is one of the problems of affirmative action. The unintended consequence is it makes people then doubt their own abilities. And it shouldn't be this way, but it is an unintended consequence, because sadly there are people who should not be in positions that got them because of affirmative action. So there are certain people that people have seen, so the assumption then can become, I know somebody else got their job because they didn't deserve it. Maybe I did too. And that's where the problem comes about. I am assumed to be most qualified. I promise you, I don't at all believe you're most qualified. So I don't believe that at all. If there are people of color in the organization who resent my hire, I can easily dismiss them and rest assured that their feelings won't carry much weight. Now that I believe. I think you'll easily dismiss a lot of people that doesn't carry anybody else that doesn't see the way things the way that you do. If resentment from employees of color does manage to come up to my attention, I can find copious validation in other supporters from my white coworkers. Again, I don't know where you work, but if somebody does something that's inappropriate, I don't see people going along racial lines in agreement. All white people believe this, all black people believe this. That's not how it works. I find copious validation and other support my white coworkers who will reassure me that our colleagues of color are the ones who are biased. No. You will find that people will give you honest opinions based upon what they see, not break up along racial lines. With race as a non-issue, I can focus on my work and productivity and be seen as a team player. This is yet another example of the concept of whiteness as property discussed earlier. Whiteness has psychological advantages that translate into material returns. Again, I don't agree with the premise, so I can't agree with the conclusion. As I move through the day, racism just isn't my problem. While I am aware that race has been used unfairly against people of color, I haven't been taught to see this problem, and as any responsibility is mine. As long as I personally have done anything I'm aware of, racism is a non-issue. This freedom from responsibility gives me a level of racial relaxation and emotional and intellectual space that people of color not afforded as they move through their day. They don't lack these benefits just because they are members of a numerical minority, and I am not. White men are a numerical minority. People of color lack these benefits because they are racialized within a culture of white supremacy, a culture in which they are seen as inferior, if they are seen at all. Raised in a culture of white supremacy, I exude a deeply internalized assumption of racial superiority. Having to navigate white people's internalized assumptions of racial superiority is a great psychic drain for people of color, but I do not need to concern myself with that. Robin DiAngelo is an anti-Semite. She has already defined Jews as being white, which Jews themselves do not define themselves as, but she says basically they are white. And therefore, because in her book she does not talk about anti-Semitism and being able to exhort and be able to exalt and become an anti-Semite, anti-anti-Semite. So therefore, by definition, she is now playing into anti-Semitism in the role of anti-Semitism in society. And because her book does not talk about anti-Semitism at all, in fact, it takes a trope of Jews as being part of another culture. They have no culture of their own or identity. She herself is an anti-Semite, and now has created this idea, because she has not come out against anti-Semitism, and nor she do anything to be an anti-Semite. So therefore, by definition, she's an anti-Semite in the anti-Semitic culture of society and the systematic anti-Semitism against Jews. By her own admission, that's what she's saying. She's an anti-Semite. So if Robin DiAngelo wants to admit to anti-Semitism, I'd love to hear that, because that's the argument she's making. That if you are not raising up and arguing against this ideology, in other words, you have to then stand up to the idea that white people are the predominant people in society, that they make up the majority of society, as it would be in any culture of any society where there are majority of anything. As I said, majority of Japanese, majority of people in India, majority of people in Saudi Arabia, the majority of people in Pakistan. I wonder what nationality is going to be the ones that are in charge of doing most of these things and feeling a part of the culture. You think that if a white person were to move to any of these countries, as I've already shown that Ramsey Dewey, who talks about the idea how people look at him in China, they don't go, oh wow, look at the white person here, we have somebody of privilege. They look at him like a disease, as he put it. So the nature of what he has to deal with is being a non-majority member of a society. And anytime you have a person that's not a majority member of a society, you can have a problem. Walk into a very fancy restaurant wearing dirty clothing and being different dressed than everybody else. What's going to happen? I don't care what skin color you are. What's going to happen? Everybody's going to look. And everybody's going to start to go, what's going on here? Who is this person? They don't look like they belong here. You can be the same skin color as everybody in that restaurant. But if you're not dressed the same, it's going to be a problem. The nature of what she's talking about here has nothing to do with racism, but just the idea of a majority culture or a majority society. Freedom of movement. I am free to move in virtually any space seen as normal, neutral, or valuable, except when people of different groups who are living in that society are more than you, in which case you feel uncomfortable, as you stated earlier in the book. Well, I might worry about my class status in some settings, for example, attending a high society event. Why am I not surprised? Such as a museum opening or an art auction, I wouldn't have to worry about my race. In fact, my race will work in my favor in these settings, granting me the initial benefit of doubt that I belong there. No, I don't think you belong there. I also will certainly not be the only white person there, unless the event is specifically organized by or celebrating people of color. In the early years of my career as a workplace diversity trainer, I co-led the workshop with Deborah, an African-American woman. After a particular grueling travel schedule, I proposed that we get away for a relaxing weekend and suggested Lake Char-D'Arlene in Idaho. I hope I pronounced that right, but I have no idea what that pronunciation is. Because I'm not white enough to know that lake. Deborah laughed at the suggestion and let me know that visiting northern Idaho does not sound like a relaxing weekend for her. Besides being a very small town, Lake Char-D'Arlene is near Hayden Lake, where the Aryan Nation was building a compound. Although not all people who live in the area are avowed white nationalists, the knowledge that people might be part of this openly racist group was terrifying for Deborah. Even if there were no organized white nationalist encampments in the area, Deborah did not want to be isolated in a virtually all-white environment and have to interact with white people who may never met a black person before. Yet as a white person, I didn't have to consider any of this. All places I perceived as beautiful and open to me racially, and my expectation is that I will have a pleasant and relaxing experience there. But we've already established that you don't believe that, because in a place when you are in a situation where you're not the racial majority, you feel very uncomfortable. You don't know what it's like to be a racial minority. Now again, if you were living in New York, you would have a very different experience, and your natural reactions would be very, very different in dealing with people from different races, different cultures, different aspects in society, and you wouldn't have these white supremacist ideology that you carry. Another way that my life has been shaped, this is just people. Another way that my life has been shaped by being white, but that my race is held up as the norm for humanity. Whites are just people. Our race is rarely, if ever, named. I don't think Japanese people walk around calling themselves Japanese. I don't think Chinese people call themselves Chinese. I think the people of the majority of the country don't walk around naming themselves. So I would agree. And if African Americans were the predominant majority in this country, I think that would be the exact opposite would happen. Think about how often white people mention the race of a person if they're not white. My black friend, the Asian woman. I enjoy young adult literature, but I'm taken aback by how consistently race of characters of color is named and how only those characters' races are named. Yes, because otherwise the assumption is going to be it's the majority of the culture. The same would be if you were writing a book from China and you were writing something in Chinese and you were saying about the white American or the Gaiji. which is called the round eye. That's a derogatory term for white people. Why do they call them Gaiji for? Why do they have those names for? Because the nature is they're different. And that difference is named because they're not the majority culture. And all you're pointing out is that white people are the majority culture in America. Wow. To use an example from school, consider that writers were all expected to read, and the list usually includes Ernest Hemingway, John Steinbeck, Charles Dickens, Fyodor Dostoevsky, Mark Twain, Jane Austen, and William Shakespeare. I suggest you read more of Thomas Sowell. He's a black author, one that would educate you immensely. These writers are seen as representing the universal human experience, and as we read them precisely because they are presumed to be able to speak to us all. Now consider the writers we turn to during the events promoting diversity events, such as Multicultural Author Week and Black History Month. These writers usually include Maya Angelou, Toni Morrison, James Baldwin, Amy Tan, and Sandra Cisneros. I'm sorry I pronounced that wrong. We go to these writers for the black and or Asian perspective. Toni Morrison is always seen as a black writer, not just a writer. But we are not looking for a black or Asian perspective. We return to white writers, reinforcing the idea that whites are just human, and people of color, or a particular kind of racialized of humans. This allows white male writers to be seen as not having an agenda or a perspective, while racializing and gender writers do. No, all writers have a perspective. Conservative writers have a conservative perspective. A liberal writer has a liberal perspective. The notion that somebody goes, oh, this person is a writer who's white, therefore does not have a perspective, is insanity. It's like you've never taken a literature class in your life. We don't believe that a writer doesn't have a perspective or an agenda or a bias. Whether they were from France or from England, whether they were from Italy or whether they were from any other country, Greece. The nature of the writer brings their experiences and their biases to their writing. But there are things in that writing that hit us all. Thomas Sowell, an African-American writer, brilliant. You should, as I said before, read his books. You'll see he has a political point of view, a particular point of view, backed up by reason and science, but a particular point of view. And that view is his biased view of the reality. Now, you could agree or disagree with it, but the nature of saying that there are white writers out there that are universal and the other people aren't is irrational. The reason why we take the ideas of Black History Month is because the school system has been, shall we say, lacking in teaching American history. But if you actually learnt American history, Black history is an American history, and not just racism and Jim Crow. Inventors, scientists, political figures. Black history is actually very rich in the society. The problem is it's not taught in great detail. The truth is, I have an issue with Black History Month that they don't teach the right things. They focus too much only on slavery and the civil rights. Like that's the only thing black people ever did in this society is slavery and civil rights. And that's untrue. It's a false narrative. We should write a book about that. False narratives get the New York Times bestseller lists. Virtually any representation of human is based on white people's norms and images. Flesh-colored makeup and standard emoji depictions of Adam and Eve, Jesus and Mary. Educational models of human body with white skin and blue eyes. It's funny because the predominant person is black hair and brown eyes. Take, for example, a photograph that was circulated widely featuring the Daily Mail. The photo of a blonde, blue-eyed white woman is captioned, "What would a scientifically perfect face look like?" Below the image in the question, is it the perfect face? This is one example. It illustrates several concepts discussed thus far. That racial frame, whiteness, and the human norm. Whiteness as an ideal of beauty and whiteness as a naturally superior. Not only is the idea behind the claim racially problematic in its own right, but it rests on reinforcing the backdrop of an early era of scientific racism. Beauty, they say, is in the eye of the beholder. And I don't know how you come to the terms of that narrative without recognizing how they did that study and whether or not they took other races and cultures into account. If we took every culture and every race and we put them up to decide who was the most beautiful, and all of them decided and let's say they came to some consensus, theoretically, then that would be considered the most beautiful at that point because of that reason. That doesn't mean it's white people that chose it. It would mean that this world chose it. Now, whether or not what that is and whether or not they were looking at it from the standpoint of what that creation would be, it's a great question. But the notion that you're questioning it that way without understanding its mechanisms and just making all these assumptions is just not a right way of making an analysis. Consider models for child development in its stages. How culture talks about children as collective group. Theorists present human development as if it was universal. Occasionally, may be distinguished between boys and girls, but even then the categories are presumed to include all boys and all girls. Now consider all the dynamics I've discussed thus far. Is an Asian or indigenous child development the same as a white child within the context of white supremacy? Now, this is something I know very much about. Yes, child development is a universal concept. Children learn language, doesn't make a difference what age, at the same time. You see, they're pre-wired. Children, when you do certain things to them, will have the same reactions no matter what culture they're in. You want to increase aggressiveness in a child? Hit them. I don't care which child you're going to do, you're going to increase aggressiveness in that child. It's the reason why that doesn't work. The reason why we use timeouts is because it's a much more effective way of disciplining without causing the aggression. It's a better way. But why in the world should we ever deal in reality with this? See, there is better ways objectively to deal with children. It doesn't make a difference the race. I'll never forget many years ago when I was going into one of the projects, young woman, had a great relationship with her, and we got along really well. And she had a young child who was having issues, and we were talking about discipline. And she said to me, no, David, you don't understand. This child's a black child. This, you guys, and she was talking about me because of the color of my skin, you guys can actually do different things for your kids. Because this child's a black child. You have to beat them. And I looked at her, and I said, that's the most racist thing I ever heard in my life. I said, because you're telling me this child has more melanin in his skin that he needs to be hit in order to listen? I don't buy that. Well, she did listen to me eventually, and she did work with me, and we did amazing things. And she said to me, David, you were absolutely right. This is an amazing thing, and this has been an unbelievable experience, and things really went well, and we put the aspect of discipline in correctly, again, from an objective standpoint, and the child responded beautifully, even though he was black. So this notion that she's talking about, the idea that black children need to be dealt with differently than white kids, is again, to me, racist, and the same racist ideology. White solidarity. White solidarity is the unspoken agreement among whites to protect white advantage and not cause another white person to feel discomfort by confronting them or they say or do something racially problematic. Wow. You mean that there's never a white person that goes over to another white person and say, yo man, you were out of line? What you did was racist? You were out of line there? There was no boss that has ever fired anybody for their racist attitudes or actions? There are people being fired on Facebook because of Facebook posts in places from people of that reason. So I don't know what in the world she's talking about. Educational researcher Kristen Sleater describes this solidarity as white racial bonding. Wow, I didn't even know that existed. She observes that white intact, they affirm a common stance on racial relating issues, legitimizing particular interpretations of groups of color and drawing conspiratorial we-they boundaries. White solidarity both silences about anything and exposes the advantage of the white person and tactic agreements to remain racially united in the protection of white supremacy. To break white solidarity is to break rank. And again, don't agree with any of that. You had people breaking that rank when in the beginning of this country that went ahead and fought against the idea of slavery, against that white solidarity as she's talking about. Again, this is so far from reality of human interaction. This is a world, I don't know what in the world she's talking about. Now, it doesn't say that there aren't people that are in groups and out groups and people that have cliques and create that, but you have that in schools of white kids themselves. You have kids that are in a clique, that they hold each other, but it doesn't mean they ever sometimes go against it when they see something they don't like. We see white solidarity at the dinner table, at parties, at work settings. Many of us can relate to the big family dinner, which Uncle Bob says something racially offensive. Everyone cringes, but no one challenges him, because nobody wants to ruin the dinner. Or the party where somebody tells a racist joke. But we keep silent, because we don't want to be accused of being too politically correct, to be told to lighten up. In the workplace, we avoid naming racism for the same reason. In addition to wanting to be seen as a team player, and to avoid anything that may jeopardize our career advancement. All these familiar scenarios are examples of white solidarity. I'm not even going to go through all the bosses I've had and the different ethnic backgrounds they've had and the things that they said that have been inappropriate through the years. And the idea is that you sometimes just don't want to shake the boat. Not because you agree or don't, it's just that it's not worth it. Why speaking up about racism would ruin the ambiance and threaten our career advancement is something we might want to talk about. Actually, yes, because the nature is that in this country, in this society, you say things or do things, it could be threatening to your job or advancement. That's not a fallacy, that's a reality. There are people speaking up now against this idea of this kind of racism and racial diversity that trainings that this type of book is promoting, who are being threatened to lose their job or their positions. They're being told to shut up and sit down because they're challenging it based upon reality level and being told no. The professor, just as an update, Professor Paviardi, I'm saying that name incorrectly, the South Carolina professor, who did not want to go to one of these trainings, he kept his job. And they gave him, thank God, a slap on the wrist of a warning in his written chart, in his stating it. And they said that he has to go to the Title IX training, which he was absolutely fine about because it's a federal training about the federal law. And it's informational, not indoctrinational. And that's the difference. This is an indoctrination of a thought process and philosophy that isn't reality-based. The very real consequences of breaking white solidarity plays a fundamental role in maintaining white supremacy. We do indeed risk censure and other penalties from our fellow whites. We might be accused of being politically correct, or might be perceived as angry, humorless, combative, and not suited to go far in an organization. Yes, I would agree. You would come across as angry, humorless, and combative. If you take every person, take a Chris Rock show. If you went to Chris Rock show and he talks about race, and you got up and get upset at every racial stereotype or role he brings out, yes, you're going to be seen as combative and humorless. In my own life, these penalties have worked as a form of social coercion, seeking to avoid conflict and wanting to be liked. I have chosen silence all too often. I think that most people would choose silence. One is because the nature of what is being said is not meant to be hurtful. There are people that make jokes about white people, Irish people, French people, Polish people, Jewish people. There are Jewish joke books out there. I don't call them anti-Semitic. I call you anti-Semitic because you don't stand up against racism against Jews. So you are anti-Semitic by your own nature because you have not written books, spoken out. You are not an ally against anti-Semitism. And because you're not an ally, you are part of the problem of anti-Semitism. So because of that, Ms. DiAngelo, you are the problem. But the nature of that and getting away from the anti-Semitism and you being the problem, that there are Jewish joke books. And I wouldn't consider somebody who says a Jewish joke anti-Semitic. And I wouldn't consider somebody who says a black joke to be racist. The nature of where that joke is coming from makes a difference. I've had black people tell me black jokes. Was I supposed to tell them, excuse me, that's racist and you shouldn't do that? Or can I appreciate the fact that they're finding levity in certain aspects of culture and society and differences and being able to laugh at it and being okay with it? Or maybe you just want to be angry and humorless. Conversely, when I kept quiet about racism, I was rewarded with social capital, such as being seen as fun, cooperative, and a team player. No, you would see that way in terms of any society, of any issue like that. Notice that within white supremacist society, I'm rewarded for not interrupting racism and punished in a range of ways, big and small, when I do. I think that if somebody was telling bad jokes and you did the same exact thing and pointed out the bad jokes, you would also be seen the same way. I can justify my silence by telling myself that at least I'm not one of those who made the joke, and therefore I'm not at fault. But my silence is not benign, because it protects and names the racial hierarchy and my place within it. Each uninterrupted joke furthers the circulation of racism through the culture. Shut down all the comedy clubs. And the ability to joke to circulate depends on my complicity. Like I said, when Chris Rock tells jokes about white people, I don't call him a racist. When the Schultz, I forgot his first name, but there's many comedians, Vince Morris, who tells jokes in terms of black culture and white culture. I don't consider him a racist. He's funny, and he's going ahead and having a commentary on the politics and society, but he's not being racist. When Jackie Mason gets up and tells Jewish jokes, he's not being an anti-Semite. So this notion that you have that Uncle Bob might tell a joke and people might cringe because the joke wasn't good or funny and they're just not getting involved in it, doesn't mean that everybody's sitting there going, yay, racism, solidarity for racism. And not wanting to destroy the meal doesn't mean that you're sitting there and being like, okay, I'm okay with it. People of color certainly experience white solidarity as a form of racism where we fail to hold each other accountable to challenge racism when we see it or support people of color in the struggle for racial justice. So the nature here that she talks about is we have to understand already something that if you do what she says and you call everybody out on all those things, you will live very quickly in a humorless and contentious society where everybody is calling everybody else out. It's cancel culture in stereo, except we're going to cancel Uncle Bob and we're going to cancel anybody else that makes any comment. And again, remember, now you can't tell jokes about anybody or anything. Sexuality, race, sexism. So think about every joke that has to be taken out and not being able to said. There goes Abbott and Costello. You can't even go back. You can't go forward. Everything has to stop. The day that humor died. The good old days. As a white person, I can openly and unabashedly reminisce about the good old days, romanticize recollections of the past, and calls for a return to former ways of a function of white privilege which manifests itself in the ability to remain oblivious to our racial history. Well, according to your logic, the good old days is still now, and therefore right now it shouldn't make any difference. Claiming that the past was socially better than the present is also a hallmark of white supremacy. Wow. There's a nature of always seeing parts of the past and the advantages the past had. And by the way, white people don't only just do this. Consider any period in the past from the perspective of people of color. 246 years of brutal enslavement, the rape of black women for their pleasure of white men, and to produce more enslaved workers, the selling off of black children and attempted genocide of indigenous people, Indian removal acts, the reservations, indentured servitude, lynchings, mob violence, sharecropping, Chinese auctions, exclusions, Chinese exclusions, exclusion laws, Japanese American internment, Jim Crow, laws of mandatory segregation, black codes, ban on black jury service, bans on voting, imprisoning people for unpaid work, medical sterilization, experimentation, employment discrimination, educational discrimination, inferior schools, bias laws and policing practices, redlining, subprime mortgages, mass incarcerationists, race, media, representational culture, erasures, attacks, and mockery, and untold perverted historical accounts. You can see how romanticizing past is strictly a white construct. But it's a powerful construct because deeply internalized sense of superiority and entitlement, the sense that any advancement of people of color is an approachment of this entitlement. Yes, only white people see the good old days, and they mean all those things when they talk about them, right? Because that's what white people do. The nature of a white person is to only see the good old days. Oops. I got a little ahead of myself there. But I'd like you to see this, because I don't think this is only a white thing.
Come back to Jamaica.
Come back to gentility.
What's old is what's new.
Come back to our beauty.
We join us.
Come back to our people.
We made it for you.
Come back to hospitality.
So make it Jamaica.
Come back to Burundi.
Make it your own.
Come back to tranquility.
Make it Jamaica.
Come back to romance.
Your new island home.
Come back to the way things used to be. Make it Jamaica again, and make it your own.
Make it Jamaica. Your new island home.
Yes, that white commercial for Jamaica. Come back to the way things used to be. Because all those black people in that commercial wanted rape, pillage, and slavery. Because that's what they were talking about. Because only white people would say such a thing. Like I said, the ridiculousness and the lack of rationality in this is amazing. The past was great for white people, and white men in particular, because their positions went largely unchallenged. Yes, because white men didn't die in droves, in wars, in battles, in history. They didn't die from famine in coal mines. They didn't die from all the situations they had to deal with in terms of work and the amount of things that they had to do. It was wonderful for white men throughout history. In understanding the power of white fragility, we have to notice that there were mere questioning of their position triggered the white fragility that Trump capitalized on. Here we go back again. I wonder why Trump's being mentioned here. There has been no actual loss of power for the white elite. We have always controlled our institutions and continue to do so for a wide margin. Yes, the majority of the population is in control of the majority of the population. Wow, what a brilliant idea. Of the 50 richest people on earth, 29 are American. I wonder why that is. Why are so many American? Well, maybe because America does something better than other countries. Of those 29, all are white. And all are two but men. Lauren Jobs inherited her husband's wealth, and Alice Walton her father's. Similarly, the white working class has always been held to the top positions within blue-collar fields, and overseas labor leaders, and fire and police chiefs. And although globalization of the erosion of workers' rights has been a profound impact on the working class, white fragility enabled the white elite to direct the white working class resentment towards the people of color. I wonder why Karl Marx wrote a similar concept. Why did he have the belief of the working class and the issues with the bourgeoisie? I don't know. This resentment is clearly misdirected given that the people who control the economy, who have managed to concentrate more wealth into fewer white hands than ever before in human history, are the white elite. Consider this data under the distribution of wealth. Now this is what happens when you have somebody who's going to talk about something, has no knowledge in the area. She quotes, since 2015, the richest 1% have owned more wealth than the rest of the planet owns. And that's 100% true. And the reason is, rich people become richer. And as they go along and they implement certain ideas, it keeps going that way. Just to give you an idea about this. If you make $1,000 a week and you spend $1,000 a week, you have $0 at the end of the week. If you take $1,000 and you spend $900, you put $100 and then you put that into something that gives you 10% interest. And then you do that week after week after week. What ends up happening? Every week you get more and more wealthy. And if you keep doing that for the rest of your life, you get even wealthier. And if your kids follow along with what you did, they become wealthier. Yet if you're the person spending $1,000 a week and you continue spending the $1,000 a week, as inflation goes, you get poorer and poorer, and the rich get richer and richer. This is basic economics. It happens to anybody that utilizes it. And this is why people that don't understand this, and by the way, Thomas Sowell, Basic Economics, great book, go read it. 8 men own the same amount of wealth as do the poorest half of the world. The incomes of the poorest 10% of the people increased by less than $3 a year between 1988 and 2011, while the income of the richest 1% increased 182 times as much. Yes, for exactly the reason why I just explained. And when money grows, it compounds. So if poor people learned how to deal with their money, they could all become richer. In Bloomberg's daily rankings of the world's 500 richest people in the world, the wealthiest three, Bill Gates, Warren Buffett, and Jeff Bezos, all white men, total net worths of $85 billion, $79 billion, $73 billion. Now, she uses three people who have tremendous skill. Bill Gates changed the world. Computer systems changed the world, whether it had been Apples or Mac or PCs. The fact is that Bill Gates changed the world in the way that we function. Warren Buffett was able to understand the markets in a way that other people have not. Jeff Bezos changes the way that we shop. These are not just people that did nothing and brought nothing to us. And the nature is, if you do things to change the world, you get benefit from that. These people didn't do nothing to gain what they got. They did amazing things, and it wasn't that they earned it. It was that they earned it. They didn't inherit it. It wasn't that Jeff Bezos inherited a company and Bill Gates inherited something. They built these things from the ground up themselves. They took risks and they made things. But let's put them down. By comparison, the 2015 gross product of Sri Lanka was $82 billion. Luxembourg, $58 billion. Iceland, $16 billion. Of the world's 10 richest people, 9 are white men. Again, because they did something. In 2015 to 2016, the world's 10 biggest corporations. And by the way, how much richer did white people get because those people made those money? Did you think that all white people are like, yeah, we all got it now. Great, high five. Go ahead, Bezos. We all get a piece of the pie. Or does Jeff Bezos' money stay in Jeff Bezos' pocket? This nature again, what does it matter what these individuals did? And saying, well, they're all white. Michael Jordan is building his own empire. And so did Magic Johnson. They took their money and they become very, very wealthy because of it. And the nature is they will continue to. Because that's what happens with wealth. In 2015-2016, the world's 10 biggest corporations together had revenue greater than the government's revenues of 180 countries combined. Yes, because in America, we live in the greatest ability to create wealth. And limiting that doesn't help anybody else. You cannot become poor enough to save somebody else. There's no amount of money, no amount of starving you could do to feed anybody else. This notion that she has is so backwards in thinking that it's problematic in understanding basic economics. In the U.S., over the last 30 years, the growth in incomes of the bottom 50% have been zero, where incomes of the top 1% have grown by 300%. Now, she goes back to modern day politics. The call to make America great again worked powerfully in service of racial manipulation of white people, diverting blame away from the white elite towards various people of color. For example, undocumented worker and immigrants of the Chinese from the current conditions of the working class. Now, this is where the insanity comes in. Because what she doesn't understand is, and again, this is not about being a fan of Donald Trump. Because there's enough issues to talk about with Donald Trump right now that we don't need to get into. But the nature of what Make America Great Again was about, if you understood, was that we're not going to have 2% growth. The growth was going to go back to a time when growth was greater. The ability to create wealth and bring people up. Now, whether you agree or disagree, the nature of what happened with African American, Hispanic, and also all minority unemployment was at historic lows during the time period. So this, whatever you'd like to say, economically, there was an advantage to the ideology. Now, was there a price later because of the taxes and all that? Oh, absolutely. I mean, there's a number of issues. I'm not going to get involved in the politics here because that would be an entire video unto itself. But the nature of what he's talking about is not the go back to America, go back to slavery and Jim Crow and all that other garbage. That's not what was meant. To take somebody out of context like that is horrific. The romanticized traditional family values of the past are also racially problematic. White families fled from cities to the suburban areas to escape the influx of people of color, a process socialists term white flight. They wrote covenants to keep schools and neighborhoods segregated and forbade cross-racial dating. Now again, depending on when you're talking about It's true. There was a time where white people were very afraid of being mixed with people of color. But then again, they were also more in terms of like the Irish were not let in, and then the Italians. There was other white people who consider white now who were also not let in. But this nature that she's talking about, the idea of the traditional family values, there's also right now, when an African American person makes it, one of my clients becomes financially successful, they don't stay in their neighborhood. They move, generally, to a whiter neighborhood. Why is that? Why do they look for that for? And it's got nothing to do with liking white people. It has to do with the idea of safety. The nature of what happens in those neighborhoods becomes more dangerous. One of the reasons why the statistic was that I think 61% want the same amount of police in African American neighborhoods. 20-something% want more police in the neighborhood. So it's 81% want the same or more. Is because there's a lot of danger in these neighborhoods that they acknowledge, they understand, they see it themselves. It's not just about the idea of race. Consider the extreme resistance to busing and other forms of school integration from white parents. In the landmark Supreme Court decision, Brown versus the Board of Education, the court ruled that separate was inherently unequal and that schools need to be desegregated with all deliberate speed. Busing children from one neighborhood into another school area to account for residential segregation became a major strategy of desegregating. Notably, white children were generally not bused into predominantly black schools. Instead, black children endured long bus rides to attend predominantly white schools. Regina Williams, a black student from Roxbury, Massachusetts, was bused into school into South Boston. She described her first day at formerly all-white school like a war zone. And again, I'm not going to argue that the nature of when this happened and the time period. Absolutely, this is the time of Jim Crow. This is the time when there was systematic racism in law, and it was just being broken. School officials, politicians, the courts, and the media gave precedence to the desires of white parents who overwhelmingly vehemently opposed school desegregation. It has not been African Americans who resisted integration efforts. It has always been whites. This is also untrue. There are many African American leaders, Bob Woodson, Malcolm X, who went ahead and said no. They didn't believe that this desegregation was a good thing. In fact, they said it was going to hurt the African American community. So the nature that there weren't African Americans saying at that time period, no, they don't believe this is good, is not even true. But again, why should we let any fact get in the way of a good story? It has not been African Americans who resisted integration. It has been always whites. The practice in our lives of white collectives have really been in alignment with the values we profess. Now, again, I think that we do have to live up to the value of the Declaration of Independence, that all men are created equal. Again, equal in rights, not in ability and not in outcome, but equal in their rights. And I think we do have to get better at that. And there's no question about that. This is not it either. At a minimum, this idealization of the past is another example of white experience and perceptions positioned as universal. How might the nostalgia sound to any person of color who is aware of the country's history? This ability to erase this racial history and actually believe that the past was better than the present for everybody has inculcated a false consciousness for me personally and as a natural citizen. Now, I'm going to stop here. And this is now going to be page 62 of White Fragility, the 4th chapter. The next part we'll be talking about is white racial innocence. I'm hoping you're seeing a lot of the problems in this book. But again, if you disagree with anything I said, please leave a comment below. If you like this video, hit like. If you dislike anything I said, please tell me. And of course, if you haven't subscribed, please do. And share, because so many people need to hear the problems with this book and its ideology, because it's destructive. And again, if you'd like to become a patron to this endeavor, please go to the Subcribe-star link below. I thank you very much. Have a good night and good mental health.